Hello, everyone. I hope you're all having a wonderful day today. This is Zakiziel here, and today I'll finally be reacting to a Commissar story, Part 4, their live Avathon for audio fixed by Old Man Reacts. Sorry to take so long in reacting to this, but it's been a rough last couple of days involving being fractured bones and hospital visits. But anyway, let's get into it.
The Tauros plowed through the field, and even as the smell of smoke and fire was blown away by the wind, my mind was racing. The regiment was doing as I was doing now, repositioning, heading to fallback points. I reached up and grabbed at my shoulder, and I was still too filled with the rush of the fight to notice the pain, except for just a twitch when I touched the leather. My fingerless gloves came away red. Jeffries, it's strange how easy you can compartmentalize information when you actually need to.
Yep, adrenaline is a heck of a thing. There's so many cases of soldiers being wounded and not even realizing it until they calm down a bit. Like, one case that I remember quite well, there's a pilot in World War II who he was in a swordfish bomber. One of the ones that actually did attack runs on the Bismarck. And thanks to the fact that the swordfish has a metal frame, and by frame I mean a framework, with canvas cloth laid over it, none of the shells that hit it actually detonated. They just passed straight through. But there was also a lot of flak that went off around him that did a number on his legs, and he didn't even realize how heavily he was bleeding from his legs until after he had landed on the runway. I believe, was it Ark Royal the carrier was involved in that? Either way.
The fact I was wounded barely even seemed to register at all. In fact, I think I was more annoyed that I had to take time away from what I had planned to actually get done to get it seen to. I curved the wheel to the left and I smelled this little rise in the ground coming out of the side of the field into a path. My foot pushed into the accelerator and I reached up, taking the comm bead out of my ear and sliding into my front jacket pocket. I come over this small rise and I cut the wheel hard to the right, sliding the Tauros, yanking myself out of the chair. From inside my coat pocket I could hear Kolo's voice, Visarion's voice, other voices issuing orders. They sounded so distant. I grabbed hold of a guardrail at almost a full run and swung myself up hard and into the gunner's chair, and I yanked the controls of the twin-link blast cannon and sighted down the crest of the hill that I had just come over. And my breathing slowed. I thought about the watercast. I thought about what he had said. 80,000.
Former watercast is now roadkill.
I had taken it at face value then, but even as overkill as that number seemed to be, there was simply something off about it. I narrowed my eyes on the ridge and I was concentrating. The number was nagging me. 80,000 Jeffries. It didn't track. As I glared at the crest of the hill I had ridden over, I already knew why it was bothering me. There were too many ships in orbit, too many vessels to carry troops and gear. If this had been an Imperial Navy flotilla with the same sorts of ships with the same numbers of transports, well, Jeffries, 80,000. Not even the most incompetent Metastortum would request a fleet the size of the one we had above us to escort something so small.
My theory at the moment is that because Tyranids were mentioned previously, and the large number of ships, too large for a detachment of that size, I get the feeling that's a case that these Tau were actually fleeing in the path of the Tyranids, and Avathon 4 just happened to be the closest place they figured that they could take over and settle down on.
The pain I hadn't been feeling from the shot I had taken, now I was feeling it. My body was starting to calm down, and the sudden scalding, tearing feeling in my shoulder gave my mind crystal clarity, and I gripped my teeth as I continued waiting. And I was just glancing around, but I was focused. Not 80,000 Jeffries. I breathed slowly. I let the realization set in on me, the pain in my shoulder and the mounting cold in my chest sharpening every sense that I had. I could hear the wind sliding through the stalks of this golden grain around me. I felt a bead of sweat slide down the side of my face. 80,000? Not hardly. The towel hadn't lied. Not entirely. But I felt this sense of absolute, hopeless rage kick in my chest, as if the drone that had shot my shoulder had bored a hole straight through me. As if I summoned the damned thing, as if the world seemed to know that I needed to commit an act of pure violence. I saw what I was waiting for. I only saw it for a fraction of a second, but it's all I knew I was going to get. The entire Tauros rocked on its suspension and the coils discharged, and the second Tau drone that had been circling me from before exploded both into vision and into destruction. I climbed down off the Tauros and walked up the hill. As I came over the rise, in the distance I could see the aftermath of my planning. Further off, barely visible, I could see another column of smoke rising in the sky. I turned my head and I was looking around slowly, seeing the first signs of war in the distance as every so often tendrils of blackness curled into the blue of the skies. I looked back down at the drone that had been following me. 80,000. I kicked the shattered thing as hard as I could, then I turned and walked back to the Tauros. There had only been basic infantry and APCs. Only basic infantry and APCs. None of the stealth suits, none of the crisis battle suits, none of that. No tanks, no battle.
Well, there were stealth suits. He did mention a few that he could see the shimmering in the air from a few circling him earlier. But I have a feeling that those ones weren't very heavily armed, so they were just performing scout roles. Although, still a stealth burst cannon is still a stealth burst cannon, and will still put holes in a human.
Suits. I swung back into the Tauros and I accelerated, focusing now on what was to come. I heard small, tinny voices coming from my pocket, but I didn't put the comm bead in my ear, not yet. I wanted to give myself the time to bury everything before I came face to face with my guardsmen. Suddenly, I realized that in the long game it didn't matter. Finally, the numbers began to settle in my head. 80,000 on a planet this size was not the assault force. We hadn't killed the invasion. We were just killing the future garrison. The Tau hadn't lied. He just didn't tell me the rest of it. A number began to form in my head, and I stared at the road in front of me, and I took my foot off the accelerator. I thought about the fleet invisible over my head. We weren't facing 80,000. We'd be lucky if we were only facing 800,000. The Tauros drifted to a stop on the road. I leaned against the door frame and took off my cap, and I turned my head into the breeze blowing off the grain. I focused on the distance, finding a place, maybe the only place right now where I couldn't immediately see smoke rising in the distance. The grain just gently rolled toward me, and the sky was beginning to just show those first signs of amber as night was coming. I stared at this ocean of gold, then breathed in the scent of the air, and once again I was reminded of how clean this place was, how pure. I wanted this moment to last forever, Jeffries. I wanted nothing more than the fleet overhead to just vanish, for me to roll into Ceres and walk into regimental headquarters that had never vanished into fire and dust. I wanted to be trapped on this world forever, training my men and attending their weddings, dealing with the politicians who ask for parades, maybe even find myself some woman who could put up with me. Don't roll your eyes, Jeffries. There exists such a creature out there. I could only imagine the Commissar that would come to replace me on this world then, doing their best not to show their absolute shock at what had become of me and vowing never to do the same. And I can imagine my smile knowing this world would do it to them too. I stared at utter peace, Jeffries, a peace I never knew how much I needed. I was home. Slowly, though, as I looked off at the last
I wonder if this was before the Commissar met the hospital, or...
pure horizon I could see, I saw this sudden plume of smoke rising. The dream was gone, the peace was gone, war was here, and in the horizon I could see a shadow that I couldn't see before. I put my cap back on my head, and I was raised to beware the Xenos, the mutant, and the heretic, and I had done so, but as I looked at the shape of the shadow, it was a Tau battleship in low orbit. I wanted to hurt them. I wanted to make them suffer. I wanted to kill them all. I thought I knew what it was to hate. I thought I knew Jeffries. Even as I watched, I saw trails of light streaming down into the coming night, more of their dropships, delivering more troops down over the horizon. I just knew it now. Even if we killed all 80,000 of the bastards that Tau said were here, I knew that they had more. No matter what happened, I couldn't stop them. I felt hope die in me, and I hated him for it. I slid back into the Taurus and activated the engine, and I started driving to one of the few forests I could see, the one that hid our base camp. 20 minutes later, I came to a stop in the camp, and my eyes shot over to the tents for the medics of the regiment. I saw a few men there, and thank the God Emperor it wasn't more. I had put the comm bead back in my ear again, and as I rolled up and I saw one of the medics running towards me with a bag slung over their shoulder, I pointed toward the bunker and the medic turned toward it running inside. I pulled myself out of the Taurus and I just stalked toward the bunker coming through the door.
I have a feeling that there's two possibilities. One is that they had very few casualties is because, his plan just worked out that well. I mean, having an ambush with heavy weapons and snipers is pretty effective. On the other hand, corpses probably wouldn't be at the medic tent.
Sarion was inside with Kolo, and the big man was rubbing the bridge of his nose. Kolo was standing near him, and I could see him whispering. Phasian was bringing the holotable online, the first flickers of a spear becoming visible in the air. I walked to where the medic was opening their bag and started pulling my coat off. Report? Viserion looked up. The big man was bothered, and I had a feeling I knew what about. Kolo spoke first.
All of my men made it back.
Kolo motioned with his head to Viserion.
We lost 5 from heavy weapons and 2 from infantry.
Oh, nice. There really were low casualties. Which I imagine is going to be also very good for morale because, well, aside from just the fact that people who tend to fight together end up developing very close bonds, because, when you have to entrust your life to someone else and fight for each other, that certainly builds bonds. But also, given how close everyone was where everyone basically is like family, I imagine actually losing someone would just hit morale especially hard.
Viserion looked up from where he was looking at the ground. He shook his head and looked like he was going to say something. I held up my hand before he could say anything and nodded to him. Viserion, you're going to lose people. Before this is all over, we're all going to lose people. He just stared at me for a few seconds. Viserion, this is going to sound cold, but you can't take it personal. You can't blame yourself. That's poison. And if you let it in, you'll drown in it. Viserion nodded at me just once, and he gave the weakest smile that I'd ever seen on the man since I knew him.
I knew all of them.
I almost continued giving the same speech that I would have given to any lieutenant in a regiment that I had been assigned to that had lost troops for the first time. I had fallen back hard into the training the Commissar had given me, Jeffries, but then I saw the look in Viserion's eye, and suddenly I didn't know what to say. For some reason, all I could think about was that the field I had been looking over before, the smoke that had suddenly appeared on the horizon. I said the only thing that came to my mind. I know. Tech Priest Phasian stepped forward, and I remembered myself. I started to pull my carapace armor off, grimacing at the pain in my shoulder, and the medic stepped forward.
You're hit, boss.
Viserion stepped up, seeming to just now notice that I was in fact bleeding. I wasn't surprised. I think it's more than a fashion statement that the Commissariat wears black and crimson as our primary uniform colors. At the end of the day, Jeffries, it does make it harder for people to see us bleed. Just a flesh wound.
That little joke about people wearing red, and so that their soldiers won't notice when they get shot and will keep fighting. Just like the Korean Admiral Yi, when he was fighting off a Japanese invasion and got wounded, had his son wear his armor, so that his forces wouldn't be demoralized by his loss.
Don't worry. I am invincible. I sat down in the chair, seeing the flicker of the first grin since I had walked in on Viserion's face. Phasian began to speak as the medic pulled a pair of scissors, and I almost glared at him, then decided to just sit back and allow the man to do his job. I looked to the sphere that resolved into Avathon 4.
The counter-strike went off with an estimated 92% efficiency. The majority of the PDF and militia forces opened fire once code word Harvest Day was transmitted, unopened in box.
Kolo beamed like a child who had just won the prize stuffed groks at a carnival. It was his idea to tell the Tau it was Harvest Day before we started shooting. While the regiment had struck at a column heading to Ceres itself, the PDF had dispersed itself throughout the villages and towns. The attack on the convoy had been signaled by me putting my cap back on, and after Kolo had fired the first round, Vox stations around the planet had transmitted Kolo's own voice saying, "Happy Harvest Day!" For a moment, I tried to picture the pure madness as the Tau wondered what was happening before the carnage kicked off. Jeffries, I still wish I had more vid feeds saved at that moment.
Regimental casualties are estimated at 7 dead, 30 wounded, 4 critical.
I glanced at Viserion, but he had steeled himself and he was paying attention.
PDF casualties are reported as light to moderate, estimated 2,000 dead, twice that wounded. Unknown status of injuries. Civilian casualties are unknown, majority unreported.
Even as Phasian talked, I saw tables popping up on the holovid, and my eyes found Ceres.
Yep, it's a good thing he gave that speech, because, yeah, if knowing 7 people that you know, probably know, that you know personally, dying, and then having that effect on him, and then 2,000 people who, granted, may not have known them as closely, but basically who were like pretty much his neighbors, really.
Ceres had not reported in yet. The medic had cut the corner of my shirt away and he was dressing the plasma burn, and I just flinched as he put gel over it.
Tau casualties are projected as follows.
Phasian reached down and pressed a button on the table. Viserion whistled. I suppressed a grin. Kolo, on the other hand...
Whee! Fuck those sons of bitches up!
He yelled and he slapped Viserion on the back. He was almost jumping at the numbers on the screen. The medic stopped working and just stood and stared and whistled.
Query. What does intercourse with the Tau have to do with these projections?
Kolo stared at Viserion for a few long seconds, and then he just started to laugh. Viserion smiled, but I was oblivious as I stared at the numbers. The medic went back to my shoulder, and I lifted my arm so he could wrap it.
What is funny?
Phasian's obliviousness only made the grin I was suppressing actually appear on my face. The regiment had killed an estimated 3,500 in the convoy, if not more. Ceres might not have confirmed civilian casualties, but they had reported over 6,000 dead Tau. There were a dozen towns that had reported Tau casualties, and the village of Gelinus had been extremely specific, reporting 2,207 dead. At the bottom of the vid screen, in bold letters, was the
Oh wow, they are massacring the Tau out there. Looks like Avathon 4 is going to be eating well on Tau steak for longer than I first thought.
tally of estimated Tau killed. I felt a grim sense of self-satisfaction. For the crime of setting foot on the planet, the Tau had lost over 32,000. Kolo? Viserion? Time for Phase 2.
I'll let Astrid know. He's still in the Medicaid tent. One of his men took a hit.
Once you finish with him, issue your orders, and you and Kolo meet me at the Tauros. We're getting on the road. Kolo nodded once, then both Viserion and Kolo moved out of the bunker. The medic was wrapping up too, and without a word he hurried to the exit. I had zero doubt that within the next 20 minutes half the planet would know. I didn't mind that at all. Phasian looked at me with his remaining human eye.
I will transmit the orders. Query, Commissar. What does fornication with the Tau have to do with battle reports?
Just transmit the orders, Phasian, and don't worry about it. It's a guardsman joke. I grabbed a data slate and I just started writing quickly, Jeffries. I didn't want him to see the grin that was on my face still. Phase 2 was simple. After our initial attack, it was just too dangerous for the regiment to assemble with any real numbers. After the hit on the convoy, the regiment had been split down into 30-man fire teams with a mix of Kolo's snipers, Viserion's heavy weapons teams, and Astrid's infantry meeting at supply caches.
Oh. Guerrilla warfare time. They're gonna be in the trees, in the fields, in the bushes. Just harrying the Tau everywhere they go. You know? So, in a way, this makes me think of a bunch of hunting parties going after deer.
Phase 2 was really simple. Pick targets of opportunity and eliminate them. The fire teams would stay on their toes, staying in the fields for camouflage and to maneuver. The 30-man fire teams would strike just as we had the convoy, doing as much damage as possible within the shortest period of time, and then withdrawing before a response could launch. If a larger target presented itself, the fire teams could combine into larger and larger groups, but each fire team had its own designated fallback point. I wanted to bleed the Tau as much as I possibly could before the end, and nothing good of it would come if I lost half the regiment because one man got tired and didn't see the signs of a Tau drone or a suit following them back. Kolo hadn't understood why we couldn't just stay together, but I felt like I had explained it well enough. The Tau would be trying to find us, track us down, and if at any point they pinned us in a place we were as good as dead, it was better just to split the regiment down into these hard-hitting small units that could hit the Tau in their soft spots, keep them nervous, and if it got messy, make them worried if they were facing one sniper firing from the fields, or 1,000. Fire teams would keep in contact and reinforce each other, band together to assault positions, but they would always fade back into their smaller parts. I stood up and I looked at my chronometer. Barely an hour had passed since I had started a war, but it was a war that I knew I wasn't going to win. But they were bleeding, Jeffries, and I grinned as I stalked out the door. Kolo and Viserion were waiting for me at the Tauros. Kolo was rapidly talking to two other guardsmen who had the long las rifles slung over their shoulders. I swung into the driver's seat and I pressed the activation rune and I started the engine. Viserion slid into the chair next to me and I looked over at the massive guardsman for a few seconds. He was staring directly at me. I pressed the activation rune again and the engine cycled down.
Why do they actually call it an activation rune instead of, say, the ignition? It's a nice little thing considering how much mysticism is involved in technology. G and 40K.
Do you know where I was stationed before here? I looked up to the hulking guardsman next to me and he just shook his head no. Well, Viserion, my first assignment was on Tyralos. I was a cadet commissar there, and I was there alongside quite literally everyone I had spent more than an hour with. For my entire life. Every student I knew from the Schola, most of my trainers, my mentor, everyone. I leaned back and I pulled the harness across my chest. Well, if you know anything about Tyralos, you know that the planet got invaded by the orcs, Viserion, and I was assigned to the Tyralos 119th, and the rest of us were put in regiments all over the planet. It was some orc warlord that broke away from the war boss known, if you might have heard of him, the Arch-Arsonist of Charadon. Well, he broke off and led a few billion orcs to the Hive World, and we never really found out a reason, Viserion. He probably just wanted to fight.
I mean, what more reason does an orc need than just having a good fight?
I looked out of the front of the Tauros and watched as Kolo turned his head to us, and I held up my hand showing I was in no rush. He went back to talking to his guardsmen. Well, the orcs attacked, and we defended the hives as best we could. And we were trying to hold out until reinforcements got there. The problem was the entire world had just sent out about 30 regiments. They translated into the warp literally 4 days before we got the first signs of trouble. The cadet commissars were put in place because when the alarms were raised, the new regiments hadn't even started basic training. Viserion blew out of breath and I nodded. Oh, don't worry, Viserion, I got worse. Tyralos has a funny way of building their regiments. They take about 10% of its forces from the veteran PDF troops on the planet, but the rest are going to be raw and they're going to be greener than you'd actually believe. From the time I got my assignment to the time that the first orcs were touching down, 5 days. That's it. That's all we had. Viserion looked back ahead of himself and I said,
I have a feeling the reason they do it like that is so that the new recruits will end up working alongside the veterans, and the veterans will teach them along the way. And you do this enough times, and eventually, everyone who survives is well, one, you have veterans to help out the green recruits, but the recruits themselves end up becoming veterans themselves within a few engagements, assuming they survive. Which is, I know, a big assumption considering the guard dying droves, but still.
back in my seat. Viserion is the things that no one expects that happen sometimes. If the orcs had translated 2 weeks prior, they'd have been facing a full-out army of infantry, tanks, and artillery, and they'd have been run right off before they even got used to breathing the air. Instead, they took 2 hives, wiped out over half the PDF, wiped out 90% of the guard, and, well, they killed everyone I knew, Viserion.
Everyone?
Everyone. I propped my arm against the bar and I drummed my fingers against the chassis of the Tauros. Viserion, I had known most of them since my earliest memories. I had grown up with them. I played with them as a kid. We all shared our first drinks together, and we all talked about trying to find a way to meet back up after we all had our sashes that marked us as commissars. As silly as that sounds, Viserion, if you can imagine a bunch of commissars talking about something like that, we did. We really did.
Aww.
I reached down and pulled up on one end of the sash tied around my waist. We all said that, Viserion, and this is the only one that was ever issued. I laid the sash back down on my thigh and I turned my head to Viserion. You know it, and I know it, Viserion. We're gonna lose. We're gonna lose people here. We're gonna lose a lot of people.
I know, Commissar. I just wasn't prepared for it.
I nodded to him. I reached back to the activation room of the Tauros and I started the engine again. I took hold of the end of my sash and pulled it up to where he could see, and then I pulled aside a small strip along the seam, revealing the inseam of the sash. Viserion looked at me for a moment before looking down at the normally hidden little band of cloth, and I looked with him at the names printed in this small handwritten script.
Did he?
My handwriting. Only 3 names were visible. Along the entire inseam of the sash, I had their names recorded. My friends, the people I had grown up with, cadet commissars that had died. Wrapped around my waist, hanging to my side always. Viserion just looked back at me in surprise. I'm gonna tell you a secret, Viserion.
Oh. Then, well, his friends may be gone, but he, it's quite, well, the fact that he's carrying their memory with him in his sash, especially considering that they all wanted to one day meet up together when they'd all earned their sashes. I don't really know what else to say other than just wow.
Viserion, no one is. I folded the sash again, hiding the names of the dead. They're all with me, even now, Viserion. They all earned their sash. Your men, they'll be with you. Even if you lose no one else, the dead will be with you. If I die, I'll be with you. I saw Kolo moving toward the Tauros now as his guardsmen jogging off in different directions. The dead are never really dead, Viserion, not as long as someone exists to remember them. Viserion sat back in his seat and was silent for a few long moments as Kolo closed down on us. Then I heard,
As they say, the fallen will be forever remembered as the Emperor's finest.
a grunt, and I looked over to see Viserion's lip curled in the beginning of a smirk. What's so damn funny?
Well, Commissar, that uniform is out of regulation.
I just grabbed a hold of the steering wheel, Jeffries, and I just tried not to grin, looking as serious as I possibly could. So it is.
To think our regimental Commissar would have let his uniform go like this.
Say another word, Viserion, and I'll shoot you on general principle. Kolo swung into the back seat. Before Kolo could even speak or strap in, I hammered my foot into the accelerator, even as Viserion started laughing. I felt my smile tugging at the corner of my mouth, but for some reason I kept my eyes narrowed as if I was contemplating murdering him as I glanced over, which normally would make a guardsman quake in their boots. Viserion only laughed harder. As we came out onto a field, I took care not to slide into open view of any roads, using the fields as cover. My guardsmen would be doing much the same, albeit on foot, and it suited us just fine. I think years of physical fitness exercise and endurance training had a lot to do with it. Another large part seemed to be the fact that the men were fighting for their homes. The 3 of us talked, one of us every so often going silent, only to start speaking rapidly into their comm beads. They hadn't asked where we were going, because it was obvious. We were going to Ceres. I reached for the Tauros' Vox receiver and hailed the city, and I asked to meet one person in particular. But as the outskirts of the city came into view, I almost dropped the receiver and heard Kolo swear, and Viserion leaned forward. Smoke was rising over the city's eastern side. Relax, I said over the sound of the Tauros. The city is mostly fine. It's most likely that the Tau transports are burning. I didn't look back, but I knew my words didn't comfort them much. To tell the truth, the side made my own blood boil, and I pulled the Tauros onto an arterial road about half a kilometer outside of town and floored the accelerator, only slowing as we began to pass buildings. People were standing, almost milling around. Some started cheering as we passed, but as we began to close on the smoke, I was steeling myself. I don't put much stock in civilians during a crisis, Jeffries. I know it. It's true. And it's mainly due to what happened on Tyralos that I don't have much faith in them. But Jeffries, it still wasn't easy to see the people of Tyros dying. And it was far less easier to see the people of Ceres dying. Kolo and Viserion were smiling, cheering back at people that they had saw and knew, but I knew what I was about to face. The closer we got, the more civilians I saw who were staring into the ground or staring at the sky, weapons held limp in their hands. I saw a woman walking, crying into her hand. I saw an elderly man walk. He was just rocking back and forth, sitting on the corner, las gun over his shoulder, and a helmet that wasn't his own in his hands. When we turned the corner, I heard Viserion start to call out, but I heard his voice die in his throat.
Throne.
Yep. Those 2,000 confirmed dead, and who knows how many more unreported that they're gonna come upon.
Kolo's eyes were wide as he looked at the street we had just turned down. I had braced myself for it long in advance, but I knew what I was going to see, Jeffries. But it didn't matter. The guardsmen with me had seen their first battle, but they hadn't seen what war could do to a city. As I drew the Tauros to the stop, I yanked myself up and out of the harness, setting foot on what was once the main thoroughfare, a place where the regiment had marched the 5 previous harvest days in a row on parade. I started walking to the first downed devilfish I saw. The first of... well, I still can't remember, Jeffries. Kolo and Viserion just fell into step beside me as we walked. The street was littered with results of blown-out buildings, Xenos vehicles, asphalt, and bodies. The stench of fried human meat and Xenos alike just drifted. Smoke poured from shop fronts and apartments along the street, their painted brick and signs either blown to pieces or blistered with heat signatures. The smoke was thick, but the smell of the bodies was thicker. I kept my face as passive as I could as I stepped over Xenos bodies and around the human ones. I stopped and looked back at Kolo and Viserion. Viserion was still behind me. Kolo had stopped and he was looking down at the body of a woman at his feet. His shoulders were slumped, and for a moment I had this gut-wrenching, horrifying thought that he might have just found his wife dead right there in the street. But I looked at the woman's face, and I felt this just disgusted relief. Because I was wrong. See to him, and the two of you stay near the Tauros. Viserion moved off to join Kolo. I turned and kept on going down the road towards my destination. A few civilian vehicles were parked, and the bodies of Tal being piled into them as the civilians laid their own dead gently on the side of the road, as far out of the way as possible. I stopped for a moment watching this kneeling woman. She had moved her rifle down and was gently drawing a dead man's hands up to rest against his chest. I stared as she drew his hands together, interlocking his thumbs with a small ribbon, tying the wrists together so the man just lay there with his hands locked in the symbol of the Aquila over his chest. I just stood there and watched her. She finished tying this little bow around his wrist, and that's when she seemed to sense that I was watching her. She turned this beautiful tear-streaked face to me, and I could see she had a bit of her ear missing, and I could see this line where this plasma bolt had come within an inch of her removing her head from her shoulders. She was beautiful, Jeffries. She jumped up to her feet, snatching her rifle up and threw it over her shoulder, and came to the absolute worst attention pose I have ever seen, ever. And then her hand snapped up into the Aquila across her own chest, and her rifle fell off her shoulder and yanked down her arm, but she didn't move. Her chin shook, and I saw loss in her eyes that almost brought me to tears at that moment to even think about Jeffries, but she stood. I heard my boot heels click together, felt my body go rigid into the posture, and returned the salute in kind. I didn't even think about it, Jeffries. I just did it. If anyone deserved to be saluted, it was someone like her. She relaxed her posture and I nodded to her. Then I turned and almost ran over another woman. She was the one I had come to find, the one I had radioed in for. She was dressed in pale blue. She looked like she didn't belong there. Everyone else was covered with ash and soot and dirt and blood, but she was completely clean. She was just dressed in these pale blue robes with a shawl over her head. And she only came up to my chest, and barely that. She was young, but when she looked up at me, her eyes were older than the ground that I stood on.
Commissar?
6 years on Avathon 4, and this was the first time I had spoken to this woman since I had introduced myself to her.
I was waiting at the choir hall, what's left of it, but I figured I'd save you a walk.
She didn't mention how she found me in this mess, and I didn't want to know. She held out her hand.
Your transmission?
I reached to my side and pulled out the data slate that I had brought, and I offered it to her. She turned and she began walking her way, and apparently she read what she was going to send to the wider Imperium, even as she seemed to instinctively guide her feet around rubble and corpses. I watched as she stopped, and then she looked back to me.
Are you sure about these numbers?
I heard her, Jeffries, but she didn't say anything. And the thoughts I had just been having about how attractive she would have been if she wasn't a witch froze in my mind. I tried not to be disgusted, and I almost demanded she stop speaking in my mind, but I remembered where I was, and more importantly, how many people were watching. I just closed my eyes and nodded, and then reopened them. For a moment, I saw genuine sadness cross her features, but only for a moment.
Did I well, Commissar?
I heard her unspoken words, Jeffries. And I hear them even now. Without another second's hesitation, she turned and she began to move back toward the building that held her and the two other astropaths, who would try to alert the Imperium to what I felt was the true scale of what this world was facing. I felt sick, because finally another person knew what I thought I knew. I would eventually brief Kolo, Viserion, and the others, but that would be later. It would not be now. Jeffries, it was just infantry here as well. And as I looked around, even as I saw the bodies of the Xenos laying dead in droves, I knew what my gut was telling me. No tanks, no specialized suits, none of the robotic battle suits were laying on the ground smoldering, just infantry, and just APCs. We had killed a solid chunk of them, but I knew it wasn't the main force, not even hardly Jeffries. When the comm bead went off in my ear, I jerked my head to the side. I wasn't expecting the noise. Tech Priest Phasian's voice was calm, but I could tell even with his mechanical tones there was something underlying it all. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed people starting to gather in small little groups.
Commissar, we are receiving reports from 3 fire teams. The tower landing armor outside of 3 population centers. Wilhelmus, Helios, and Dante are all reporting large landers touching down within 10 kilometers.
That was fast.
There's more, Commissar. 2 minutes ago, we started receiving a repeating message on multiple frequencies. Patching you in now, message will repeat in less than 10 seconds.
I looked around and lowered my head as I heard a chime in my earpiece. People were gathered around each other, listening to the same music that I could hear now playing in my ear, some sort of light and flowing garbage. And then it began to quiet down, and then this voice came through and my shoulders stiffened.
I, Shasa Viola Montir Shavelna, commander of the Tau, Krut, Vespid, and Quivessa, trusted of the Ethereals, and most high defender of the Viola Sept, honored lord of the warriors of Ashea, Kovret, and Voras, general amongst generals, commander of the finest fire warriors, unstoppable leader, the protector of the tenets of the greater good, the hope and comfort to those who embrace it, and the bane of all who come against it. Command this world and all its peoples to surrender to me voluntarily and without any kind of resistance. And do not permit yourself to trouble my forces with your attacks. Respond that you acknowledge and will comply.
I stared ahead of myself, looking at the street directly ahead of me, and I set my jaw. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw most of the civilians had stopped moving and were standing around. Most of them standing around vehicles or people with handheld.
I am afraid that that what's gonna end up happening if they refuse is that the town might start opening up with orbital bombardments, which an orbital bombardment doesn't have to be a full-on blasting the planet. It's just that, so since it's the tower we're talking about, I believe they, at the very least, would have about the same precision as the endearment orbital bombardments, which is being able to hit a target the size of a city. And being able to hit all the various cities would result in a lot of civilian casualties. Which, for how close-knit the people on Avathon 4 are, that's not going to do anything good for morale, not the slightest.
Held Vox units. I heard that music again, playing around with the transmission. I yanked my comm bead out of my ear. In the smoke of the street, the sound of the alien music felt like a hand over our heads ready to slap us down. I saw this uniform moving towards me, and as I looked to my left, there was Kolo standing there, a small Vox transmitter of his own in one hand. He was holding it to his ear, and the look on his face said it all. He was disgusted. Viserion was not too far behind, leaning against a downed devilfish with his massive arms crossed, staring off into the street beyond, and I knew. I glanced around and I saw the same look and attitude repeated over and over. I knew it because behind the mask I was putting up, I was feeling the same. It's hard not to feel beaten when you can hear the crying. When you can smell the voice of that miserable wretch started again. It seemed to hit the street like a wave, Jeffries. Hands came up to rub against foreheads. Prayers started getting louder, and I saw Kolo just hurl the Vox receiver against the devilfish and swear. I saw the eyes on me, the eyes turning to me, what felt like a million eyes, civilians watching me, unable to meet my eyes when I looked back at them. Suddenly I felt anger, white-hot, washing over me. I shoved my comm bead back into my ear. Shut the damn thing off! No, wait! I started stalking back towards the Tauros. Get ready to receive and transmit back! I didn't notice anyone else on the street moving, but as I passed, hearing the Xeno's voice coming out of vehicles and handheld Vox transmitters, I knew I was being watched. I didn't know what I was gonna say, but I had to respond, Jeffries. I had to. I didn't know Kolo was 2 steps behind me, Viserion just behind him. I didn't notice that the civilians were right on their heels, a good part of them anyhow. I just knew I had to say something. Phasian said in my ear, and I just reached into the Tauros and snatched up the Vox transmitter. I looked up at the mostly empty street at the end of the column, seeing the chronometer tower up of the road, a line of black impacts across it, leaving it permanently at 5 after 5. The telltale signs of some Tal's pulse rifle having shot it when he was probably dying. I slammed my finger down on the switch and I started my transmission. Commander Shitala, the Tyrannid's own kith and kin, professional ass-kisser of Avathon himself. What the hell kind of warrior are you when you can't even kill a Gretchen with your own naked ass? Horror shits and your army eats. You will not, you son of a whore, make slaves of Emperor-blessed Imperials. We have no fear of your army, and on the fields of Avathon 4 we will fight you. Fuck your mother! I heard the sudden chorus of cheers and I just bellowed louder. You gene-stealer reject, chaos-worshipping atheists, grox fucker of 4 or whatever, crude piss-tester of a Shia, vespid proctologist of Covetta, an assisted suicide artist of your own worthless fire waters! The entire street collapsed into laughter and I held down the receiver, holding it up as people yelled out insult after insult, hurling them in between peals of laughter. I made a hard cutting motion with my hand and set my feet, making a show of just breathing in before I bellowed into the receiver. You are the crick in my dick! You are the scapegoat of the Ethereals! You son of a bitch! Fuck your own mother!
Scapegoat of the Ethereals. That one probably hits pretty hard considering the way the Ethereals like to keep certain things about the greater good nebulous so they can pass blame away from themselves.
The civilians bellowed and I saw a smirk on Kolo's face and I turned around and yelled into the receiver again. So this world declares you lowlife. You won't be herding groks for the Imperials. You'll be the groks. So I'll conclude because I don't know the time after one of your stupid Tau shot our damn chronometer while they were screaming in pain. We don't know the time. I can't remember what day it is. The sun is up, the stars are out, the year's with the Emperor. The day's the same as it is here, as it is up there, for this kiss our ass. I flung the receiver back in the Tauros hard enough to break it, to even more yells of approval, and suddenly I felt something I wasn't used to feeling, Jeffries. It almost made me jump. But I just relaxed into the warm embrace of a rush of people coming in around me. I felt Viserion at my side, guiding me to the Tauros as I kept my features set in stone. Around us, the civilians were in a frenzy, made even worse by when I jumped in the Tauros and started the engine. Kolo dragged himself into the back and I watched as the people made way. I grinned to myself. Make him hurt, Jeffries. Make him bleed.
Wait a minute. Is this music? Is this music from by Pentakill from League of Legends? It is. But yeah, that was awesome to listen to, and I'm hoping we get to see listen to a part 5 if sometime soon. Also, there's the string of insults thrown at the Tau commander. I can only imagine what his face must have been like when he heard that. Probably didn't understand like a good half of it, but still. And oh boy, what a harvest day it's turning out to be with all the dead Tau. Who knows? Maybe Avathon 4 will is going to become well known in the future for its exports, for its of a prime Tau steak. Anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed it listening with me. And if you aren't already, definitely check out Old Man stuff. Links are in the description below. He really deserves the attention, and he and everyone else who participated in this did some excellent work. But until next time, ta-ta!